Salutations, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, and in this video I'm going to be doing my bit to stop a war between the United States and Iran. Well, I'm very worried about what's happened recently. The US government has ripped up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, if the United States is not going to abide by this Iran deal, why should the Iranians? The US has reneged on its word. So the Iranians may hold themselves absolved of all their obligations, and it gets worse. The US government has just announced that they're going to introduce some severe sanctions on Iran aimed at crippling their economy. So the Iranians are rightly angry. They entered into this agreement in good faith. They abided by the agreement by all accounts. So this is to prevent them getting a nuclear bomb, so we're told. The US government doesn't even contend that Iran is attempting to make a nuclear bomb. They've got only a small amount of uranium. They got rid of 98% of their uranium a few years ago, and they're working on civilian nuclear power. Now, the Israeli government said, oh, but we have documents from prior to 2015 showing that they had nuclear programs. Now, that may well be a forgery, but even if it is genuine, that still doesn't prove they're trying to make a nuclear bomb now. They were abiding by the agreement. And the US government says, well, the Iranians are helping the Syrian army, which is true, they are. They're completely open about that, as they're absolutely legally entitled to do. One sovereign state can lend military aid to another, which the US does in dozens of countries around the world. They don't like to admit it, but even indirectly in Syria, bombing ISIS does actually help the Syrian government. Though bombing the Syrian army doesn't. Now, the Iranians, they are helping the Houthi rebels in Yemen. That's true. Now, that's illegal. The US is on firmer ground there. But then the US helps insurgents elsewhere in Syria. Insurgents, some people would call them terrorists. If they're fighting against the recognized government of a sovereign state, that is illegal by definition. And so most people would say unlawful, premeditated violence with a political motivation is terrorism. Perhaps I digress. Saying that the regime is repressive, and again, it's not fully democratic country, that's true, but the US has a very cozy relationship with governments which are much more despotic than Tehran, so it's flagrantly hypocritical. There we are. So I'm worried about it, that the US will be gearing up for another war. Is it perhaps that Trump wants to distract from the Mueller investigation, or the economy stagnating? So the deal was working. Iran didn't have nuclear weapons. Since 1990, Israel has said every single year the Iranians are about to get a nuke. They've been the boy who cried wolf. The Israeli government has lied and lied and lied about this issue, has absolutely no credibility whatsoever, not one iota. America reneging on this deal has won plaudits in Israel, that's true, and some of the neoconservative hawks. Now, one thing about conservatives is they're meant to have a forward-looking memory, but some of these ultra-hawks really have no memory, are determined to unlearn all the lessons of the past 15-odd years. Regime change is not going to pan out beautifully. And John Bolton was in Paris recently addressing some Iranian exiles and calling for regime change. So maybe that's it, that's the ulterior motive, whose agenda is scarcely even hidden. That would be illegal to change the regime just for the sake of it, and it's by far better than certain other regimes in the region that the US supports. It's not as hideous as others, which I could mention. The Israelis obviously perceive Iran as a threat, and I can see how they could be if they massed conventional forces on Israel's border. That would be worrying for the Israelis. But as Israel has a nuclear bomb with which they could wipe out the Iranians might feel, well, the only way we can prevent ourselves being nuked by the Israelis is by developing nuclear weapons of our own. Now, I don't know if the Iranians are trying to develop a nuclear weapon or not. It seemed fairly probable that they were, but we mustn't go to war on the basis of a probability. And if they did develop nuclear weapons, well, we could just live with it. The principle of deterrence could work. The Iranian government is not as irrational as some people seem to claim. It's not willing to have millions of its people die. Though if they were invaded, I think the ground war would not be pretty for the US, would not emerge from it with much swagger or glory. So Israel's introduced nuclear weapons in the Middle East, not Iran. Israel refuses to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Israelis stole some of the military technology from the US. I mean, they were spying on the United States. Jonathan Pollard, for example, who was released by President Obama. It's staggeringly hypocritical, dangerous and dishonest to start all this saber rattling against the Iranians. There would be no justification for this war. And it was a very worrisome sign that Trump appointed a bloodthirsty fool, John Bolton, as the National Security Advisor. And his ultra-abrasive style did the US no credit when he was their ambassador to the United Nations several years ago. It's a massive fuck you to the international community. And if the US is going to behave like that, well, why should other countries play nice with them? So the whole thing is eerily reminiscent of this drum roll towards war in 2003. And so some people are determined to repeat all the mistakes of that era. Incidentally, I supported and still support the liberation of Iraq in 2003, but the situation was very different. I won't talk through the parallels and the dissimilarities right now. But even then, I think even the most hawkish person must admit that the liberation of Iraq in 2003 wasn't handled that smartly. Could have been done better with fewer people killed and all the rest of it. Refashioning the Middle East in America's image is not going to work. This notion has been tested to destruction. The idea that democracy can be introduced by drone strike is completely specious. And even if you do have a democracy, they are not going to be Republicans and Democrats. They're going to have their own political parties, which is not going to be to America's liking. Some Americans have this completely inflated notion of the virtue of their own country. And I know it's difficult for a superpower not to feel like that. British people often felt like that a century ago. Germans often felt like that decades ago, or Chinese people are starting to feel like that. And French felt like that perhaps a century ago, and on and on. Because they have military superiority, they mistakenly believe they have moral superiority. And every aspect of their civilization is by far the most advanced, and any right-thinking person would wish to emulate them. And this is a delusion. So this bogus notion has driven much of Washington's foreign policy. Iranians don't want to be Americans any more than Americans want to be Iranian. Now, there are certain aspects of American life which some Iranians would like. I suppose they'd like the prosperity, someone that would like fairer elections or a greater degree of freedom of expression, but they don't necessarily want to emulate the American first past the post system, or everybody having guns or things like that, or gay rights, for instance. A lot of Americans are uncomfortable with that either. It's something that really staggers me that some American conservatives can so loathe Iran. Well, Iran certainly got school prayer. And you believe in the right to bear arms? Well, the Iranians would like to bear nuclear arms, so you claim. So what's wrong with that? This attempt to invade Iran will be sheer gangsterism. And Trump said that Bush should have got the oil from Iraq. He put it that crudely: simply steal it, go in, it's smash and grab, take the oil without paying for it. And that is how, frankly, he expresses himself, and that's the way he sees the world. It really is a zero-sum game, and it's about robbing people. That's more or less how he's run his business, defrauding people with Trump University, which wasn't a university. Anyway, it gets my goat that some people in the US government should rail against Iran whilst heaping praise on some of the monstrous despots around the world. So authoritarian systems are the norm in the Middle East. A few of them are democratic, a few of them are halfway in between the two, and the Iranian one is halfway between the two. I know the Council of Guardians vetoes candidates they think are too liberal. All right, it'd be better if they didn't do that. But there is not a sufficient causus belli. Right, structuring societies on abstract lines is not going to work. The notion that the US Constitution can be grafted onto a very different situation in Iran is false. So don't try it. Don't try to mold another country to your system. Robespierre said after the French Revolution, "No one welcomes armed missionaries." So that's that. Now, what gives me a little optimism is there are voices of reason in the United States and indeed in Israel who say this war would be crazy, it would be a bloodbath.